Today we will be reviewing the Silverman CWC Chronograph reissue. Based on my research, the first asymmetrical British military chronograph appeared on the scene in the late 50s. This was the Lemania Series 3. For what it's worth, the Series 1 and 2 used a standard round case. The purpose of the asymmetrical design was to help protect the crown. Unfortunately, the origin of this design is uncertain, as I have not been able to find any Ministry of Defense documentation. The earliest reference, as per my research, is the Def Stan 66-4 Part 2 from 1970. That was the year that the Ministry of Defense finally accepted two-button asymmetrical chronographs. Prior to that, most were required to have one button, like the Series 3 mentioned. This policy change allowed the cheaper Reissue 7733 to be used instead of the higher-end Lemania 2220. Since 1970 and lasting into the 80s, a few companies started producing these new two-button asymmetrical watches. The brands were Hamilton, which went bankrupt in the early 70s. Their UK director Ray Mellor started his own brand CWC to pick up on the old Hamilton Ministry of Defense contracts in around 1972. In the 80s, Newmark and Persista produced similar watches. Unfortunately, with the passage of time, though, they were made redundant and were ultimately phased out. In 2002, Silverman's bought out CWC and started producing reissues of some of their old military issue watches. This chronograph is one of them. Aesthetically, it is highly polished, unlike the brushed originals. It's an odd choice, I will admit. The lug bars are still fixed, so can only be worn on a NATO or open-ended strap. The acrylic crystal is quite high and contributes to the 14mm height. The lug-to-lug length is 47mm, and the diameter without the crown is 39mm. The movement is a Reissue 7760, the hand-winding only version of the 7750. Interestingly enough, this was the base movement for a number of very pricey modern IWCs. The movement itself is now discontinued. The dial and hands have tritium paint on them, so you won't be getting long-lasting brightness. Also, they look quite green in bright light, just like the Royal Navy Diver reissue I recently reviewed. The hands appear to be slightly thinner than the original CWC chrono hands. The case-back designations are 6645, which is the NATO code for military watch, 99, which is the NATO code for the UK, 924-3306, which is the stock number, and the 007 means that it's the 7th watch produced in the 2003 batch. And here's another shot of the huge acrylic crystal. It's really nice to see that on a modern watch. As for my conclusion, even though I've had this for a while, it's taken me forever to find some open-ended straps that I really like. Sure, it can be, and maybe even should be worn on a NATO, but the highly polished case seems a bit too, let's say, fancy for it. And that takes us to what this watch really is. It's a higher-end reissue of a fairly basic and utilitarian watch. And having just checked Silverman's website, I guess it's not surprising that it's listed for over $2,000 US right now. I paid half of that for my like-new version for reference. Unless you absolutely must have a polished case, it probably makes more sense to pursue one of the actual issued chronographs instead, at least at the retail price point. With that caveat out of the way, I will say that it is a very well-made and fairly unique modern watch. It's a limited edition of 450, and it's the only new watch you can still buy that has tritium paint and the discontinued 7760 movement. Now that I think about it, it's probably one of the better modern watch reissues aside from maybe an IWC Mark 12. As you know, reissues typically get lost in translation and end up being, amongst other things, enormous. At least in this case, you can always refinish the case to get rid of the shininess. That's about it with this review, and as usual, thanks for watching.